I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV, Velocities in Music, the best kept secret in music reviews. A couple of months ago, a well-known guy named John Frusciante came out with a solo record, his 12th solo record. This guy's been around the block a few times. That one was called Enclosure, and we are going to review that for you guys today. Now, before we get into, John Frusciante and who it is, and what he represents, I gotta say, this is one of the most experimental records I've ever heard. I mean, he is all over the place on this record.
Definitely.
But Tom, who is John Frusciante?
Well, he really came to be known as the guitarist for Red Hot Chili Peppers, probably what he's known best for still
absolutely.
today. In the late 80s, when the previous guitarist for Red Hot Chili Peppers had died, and John Frusciante was like 19 years old when he joined the band. He was kind of this young prodigy on the guitar, and I mean he's come to be known as one of the best guitar players in the history of guitar playing, in the history of rock music. I mean he's a great performer. Here on a solo album, solo career in general, I mean he's been putting out solo albums about as long as he's been with the Chili Peppers. And
yeah, we actually
even then, I mean
his first one, usually just a t-shirt.
Yeah. And he kind of left that band and would come back, and he was still doing solo work through that whole thing. But his solo work is much more experimental, as you said. And really, what's interesting about his solo career, if you go back and listen to a lot of his work, I mean, he rarely repeats himself.
Right.
He's a very creative guy. He embodies that just kind of epitomal picture of the restless musician, in my mind. He's never willing to sit in the same place. He's always wanting to explore his own potential and what he can do musically.
Now, in all of his solo records, you can pretty much expect some sort of cool guitar solos or diddlies or things like that.
And you do have some of that here, but it's certainly not the focus on Enclosure.
I mean, for the past few albums he's put out, his focus has definitely shifted from just being more of a lo-fi sound and just like indie kind of underground just guitar rock to being more electronic based.
Yep. That's absolutely
and I'd say that Enclosure, like, that is the thesis point of this record, is he is exploring with electronic beats, lots of layered electronic melodies, and then he likes to put in guitar, usually later on in the track, some sort of produced or guitar line that has some sort of effect and works with the other melodies.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because it's not necessarily the melody itself, but a lot of the time it works with that, and enhances it or adds some kind of just cool kind of side effect.
It's never the focus of the song.
Yeah.
Well, there is one song later on that I think that does have the guitar at the focus, but for the predominance in this album, I really feel like the guitar is not the focus. It is all about what he's doing with the electronic melodies. And usually the electronic melodies are fast paced. And there's different ones. He has kind of a lower, kind of thicker one that goes with the beat and kind of does some offbeat stuff that really enhances that either electronic or actually he does mix in a few like authentic drum beats in there.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And those are kind of, I thought it was really crazy because he would intertwine those with electronic beats. And anytime an artist does that, I always, A, it's really risky because it's an inconsistent sound.
Yeah.
And B, I think it adds a lot of energy to the sound. So it was cool to see him do that. Now I would say that energy is kind of one of the shining examples of what he's going for on this record. He wants to have energy in all these songs. They never get too drony.
Yeah, and the beats, I think, are the big part of what you're talking about, because he'll go from this kind of like house or jungle type sound and then jump into like what sounds like freeform jazz kind of drumming. I mean, very frantic pretty much all the time, but the palette that he's using to present that idea is drastically different, and especially like on tracks like Sleep, track 2 comes to mind, where the beat will just shift. It'll just shift in the middle of the song completely. Well, actually it does it on the first track too, Shining Desert. And the rest of the song, though, will stay somewhat the same. So it's like whenever he's shifting one thing, another thing is remaining constant. So you really get an idea of the contrast between those different pieces. But one thing that we haven't talked about yet is John Frusciante's vocals, which are very interesting. And he's always been kind of an odd vocalist. You even hear him sing backup and harmony a lot on the Chili Peppers work. But there, he's a little more smooth, and he's also not at the forefront. Anthony Kiedis is. So here, it's very interesting when his vocals take center stage vocally in the music. I would even say that his vocals are rarely really what you're paying attention to, especially because of how they're mixed and produced, but at times they certainly are.
Yeah, usually it's all about the vocal layering. He's layering his own vocals and trying to do harmonies with his own vocals, but usually they're not that at the forefront of the mix. Usually they're kind of buried and muddled in this like electronic and beat swirl that you hear. The beat is definitely the loudest thing in the mix, and I'll get more into that in a second, but as far as the vocals are concerned, there's many times on this record, and I think that it's pretty inconsistent between the tracks as to if John Frusciante's vocals are like the thing you're supposed to listen to or not. And I gotta say, on the tracks where he does less of the harmonies, like on the first track where he's you have a lot of harmonies and they're kind of in the mix, it sounds really nice actually. I think he does a good job there. But there's other tracks where it's more at the forefront and you don't have that harmonization, and I just feel like his voice just isn't strong enough. Or maybe it's the vocal parts themselves. Something about that delivery just kind of causes it to sound a little off-kilter to me.
And I think that really is what determines the success or failure of this record for the listener, is that I think the ideas presented here are really cool. And they're consistently good ideas. I really like the sound. It's very frantic, it's very odd, and it's appealing to me. However, the way he executes it based on the songwriting, I feel like he's trying to stay so true to that sound that sometimes it simply doesn't work with the song that he's writing.
I agree. And the other thing something that really bothered me about this record is just the general production. There's numerous times where just whatever instrument I'm hearing in the mix come out and like hearing some sort of melody, I just don't like how he chose to produce it. It just doesn't sound good to me. And the other thing is mixing. I think that there's a lot of times where the beats are just too overwhelmingly loud. I'm sure this is purposefully done, but it's not what I want to hear. I want to hear, I want to hear the electronic melodies. I want to hear some of the vocal harmonies that he's doing. I don't want to hear nothing but the beat. And especially a good example is in track 1. This is actually why I did not pick this track, is when he brings in, that's a good example of when he has an electronic beat and then an authentic drum beat. He's trying to mix them together, especially in the second half of that song. That when the authentic drum beat comes in, it's way louder than everything else you hear, and it just is so distracting. It just sounds sloppy, honestly. And there's numerous times on this record where I was like, damn, is this even a finished album? Like, I feel like this thing is just not polished at all. And whenever you have, guitar and electronic and electronic melodies and electronic beats, I expect a more polished sound. It's really hard. Very few artists are able to pull off a lo-fi production style with electronic music. Metronomy is the only one that really comes to mind. And this is very far from Metronomy, right? I think a little bit more clarity, a little bit more, just attention to detail in the production, and just care more about how these things sound. And I think these songs would have been a lot better packaged for an album listen. Enclosure isn't a bad record because it's so full of ideas, and he does have so many great ideas here that it's just fun to listen to. But I gotta say, as far as being like an album that's just top-notch or really something that I want to come back to, this just isn't it, because it's just not well done enough, and because each track is overflowing with ideas, it doesn't stick with one consistent idea or actually like polish it or think it through enough to actually deliver it in one cohesive chunk. It's just like chunks of ideas. I just couldn't get into this album quite as well. There were a couple tracks. We both picked Stage. I thought was a great song.
Yeah, that was a great one.
But overall, I just couldn't get into this record because of those barriers.
Kind of a way to summarize what you were just saying, at least from my perspective. And it's funny because what happens in track 1 there that you were pointing out didn't really bother me as much. I really like that track. But the same kind of thing happens throughout the album. And different examples of it will affect different listeners in different ways. Sometimes some of them people will love, some of them people will hate, and it'll be entirely inconsistent. But what it comes down to is I just think that a lot of these things were, this is going to sound odd, but I think they were either not thought out enough or too thought out.
Right.
It's like he didn't just let it go with the flow. It doesn't feel natural, I guess is what I'm saying. I mean, there are times where it seems like, okay, you're switching to this other chord progression or you're throwing this beat in there. What's the reason for it?
Yeah.
What function does it serve? It seems like he was just like going crazy with the creative mind that he has and not really having the tact to reevaluate the decisions he was making on the album.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's a visionary. He has been at the forefront of music for a long time now, has a lot of great ideas, and I just think that his ambition is what hinders this from being a better record.
Yeah, if it could be honed a little bit more.
Yeah, and that's why I think he actually makes a great accompanying artist and not a great solo artist. And even though like we loved his first record, this This is obviously, you know, the 12th iteration, and he's evolved over time. So, you know, it's definitely not a masterpiece in my mind. I'm going to go 65 on this. I thought it had some bumps in the road that I just couldn't get behind.
I'm going to go even 70.
Okay, so that puts this in the upper 60s for us, probably overall. Not one of our most recommended records. It's just significantly below our average of 77, what Mark we consider solid records and above. So what did you guys think of Enclosure? This one's been out for a couple of months, and John Frusciante is a pretty well-known guy. You know, if you've had thoughts about this album, I'm sure there's a lot of you out there that really like it. We'd love to hear your perspective. Give us a comment at www.velocitiesandmusic.com or youtube.com/velocitiesandmusic. As always, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and let us know what records you'd like to see Tom and I review on this channel. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
And we are VIMTV, moving music critique forward.